Dr. Sarah Chen's eyes fluttered, open to an unsettling silence that immediately set her nerves on edge. The familiar hum of the research facility's ventilation system, usually a constant background noise that helped her sleep during her overnight shifts, was conspicuously absent. She sat up on the narrow cot in her office, pushing aside the thin blanket she'd wrapped around herself after working late into the night on viral protein sequences. The digital clock on her desk glowed 6:47 a.m., but something felt fundamentally wrong about this morning. The usual sounds of her colleagues arriving for the early shift, footsteps echoing through the corridors, the electronic beeps of security badges, the distant chatter of the night security team preparing to leave, were nowhere to be heard. Instead, an oppressive quiet pressed against her eardrums like a physical weight. Sarah swung her legs over the side of the cot and immediately noticed the emergency lighting was active, casting eerie red shadows across her cluttered office. The backup power system only activated during critical situations, and her heart began racing as she realized the main power grid had failed. She reached for her cell phone, but the screen showed no signal bars and a small notification indicating all cellular towers in the area were offline. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to process what could cause such a complete communications blackout. Moving to her office window, she peered through the reinforced glass at the city beyond, expecting to see the usual morning traffic beginning to build on the highway that ran past the facility. Instead, she saw abandoned cars scattered across the roadway, some with their doors hanging open as if their occupants had fled in panic. The sound of her office door's electronic lock disengaging made her jump, and she spun around to see the heavy metal door slowly swinging open. Dr. James Morrison, her research partner and closest friend at the facility, should have been the one entering, but the corridor beyond remained empty. Sarah called out his name, her voice echoing strangely in the silence, but received no response. She grabbed her lab coat and stepped cautiously into the hallway, immediately noticing the scattered papers and overturned office supplies that littered the floor. The walls bore strange scratches and what appeared to be dark stains that her scientific mind tried to rationalize as spilled coffee or ink, though her instincts screamed otherwise. As she made her way toward the main laboratory, Sarah's footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the polished floor. The facility's biosecurity protocols had clearly been compromised. Several doors that should have been locked were standing ajar, and the card readers flickered with error messages. She passed Dr. Rodriguez's office and noticed his desk chair was overturned, his computer still running but displaying a screensaver that indicated it hadn't been used for hours. The coffee mug beside his keyboard was still half full but had grown cold, and his glasses lay broken on the floor beside a small pool of what looked disturbingly like blood. The main laboratory told a more disturbing story. Equipment worth millions of dollars had been knocked over or damaged, and several of the containment units that housed their viral samples were dark, suggesting a complete power failure that would have compromised the integrity of their research. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she noticed long scratch marks carved into the metal surface of one containment unit, as if something with incredible strength had tried to claw its way out. She quickly accessed the emergency protocols manual from her memory and began making her way toward the facility's communication center, where she hoped to find some explanation for the chaos surrounding her. The communication center's door had been torn completely off its hinges, hanging at an unnatural angle that suggested tremendous force had been applied from the inside. Sarah hesitated at the threshold, her scientific curiosity warring with a primal fear that urged her to flee. Inside, she found the emergency broadcast system still functional, its screens displaying automated messages that made her blood run cold. News reports from around the world spoke of a viral outbreak that had begun sometime during the night, spreading with unprecedented speed through major population centers. The symptoms described aggressive behavior, loss of higher cognitive functions, and an insatiable hunger for human flesh, painted a picture so horrifying that her rational mind struggled to accept it as reality. The facility's security cameras, still operational on backup power, revealed the truth she had been dreading. The corridors that should have been bustling with her colleagues were now occupied by figures that moved with jerky, unnatural gaits. These weren't her friends and co-workers anymore. They had become something else entirely, something that made her stomach turn with revulsion and terror. Sarah realized with growing horror that she might be the only uninfected person left in the entire facility, trapped in a building full of creatures that had once been human but were now driven by an insatiable hunger for living flesh. The world as she knew it had ended while she slept, and her fight for survival was just beginning. 3 days had passed since Dr. Sarah Chen's terrifying discovery at the research facility, and the world had transformed into something unrecognizable. She had managed to escape the building through a service tunnel, clutching a backpack filled with emergency medical supplies and her research notes about viral mutations. The city streets told a story of chaos and desperation. Abandoned vehicles created metal graveyards on every major road, while broken windows and looted stores bore witness to humanity's rapid descent into survival mode. Sarah had been moving carefully through residential neighborhoods, avoiding the main roads where the infected seemed to congregate in larger numbers, when she first heard the sound of human voices coming from what appeared to be a fortified grocery store. The building's windows had been boarded up with wooden planks and metal sheets, creating a makeshift fortress that showed signs of intelligent planning rather than panicked desperation. Sarah approached cautiously, her heart pounding as she called out softly, identifying herself as a doctor and survivor. The response came from above, a gruff male voice demanding she prove her humanity by reciting the alphabet backwards, a clever test to ensure she retained higher cognitive functions that the infected had lost. After passing this unusual examination, she was allowed entry through a carefully constructed airlock system that prevented multiple people from entering simultaneously. Inside, Sarah met the unlikely group that would become her new family in this transformed world. Marcus Williams, a former Army sergeant with graying temples and weathered hands, had assumed leadership through a combination of military experience and natural charisma. His tactical knowledge had been instrumental in fortifying their position, and his calm demeanor helped keep the group focused during the most terrifying moments. Elena Rodriguez, a registered nurse from the local hospital, had been working a night shift when the outbreak began and had witnessed firsthand the rapid progression of the infection. Her medical expertise complemented Sarah's research background, and together they had begun documenting the behavioral patterns of the infected creatures roaming outside. The youngest member of their group was Tommy Chin, no relation to Sarah despite the shared surname, a 17-year-old computer programming prodigy who had been live-streaming a gaming session when the world ended. His technical skills had proven invaluable in maintaining their communication equipment and monitoring emergency broadcasts from around the globe. Despite his youth, Tommy displayed a remarkable ability to adapt to their dangerous circumstances, using his knowledge of the building's security systems to create early warning networks that alerted them to approaching threats. The most surprising member of their group was Mrs. Margaret Patterson, a 73-year-old retired librarian whose quiet determination and unexpected survival instincts had already saved their lives multiple times. As Sarah integrated into the group, she began to notice disturbing changes in the behavior of the infected creatures outside their shelter. During her first night with the survivors, she observed something that chilled her to the bone. The zombies were no longer wandering aimlessly as individuals. Instead, they were beginning to move in coordinated groups, almost like a primitive hive mind was emerging from the chaos of the infection. Through the reinforced windows, she watched as dozens of the creatures gathered in the parking lot, swaying in unison as if responding to some unheard signal. Their movements were becoming more purposeful, more organized, suggesting that whatever virus had transformed them was continuing to evolve. Elena shared her own observations from the hospital during those first crucial hours of the outbreak. She described how the infected had initially been driven by pure instinct, attacking anything that moved without strategy or coordination. However, the creatures she was observing now showed signs of learning and adaptation. They had figured out how to open simple doors, they avoided obvious traps, and most disturbing of all, they seemed to be communicating with each other through low-frequency sounds that were barely audible to human ears. The implications were terrifying. If the infected were developing collective intelligence, their small group survival strategies would need to evolve rapidly to stay ahead of this new threat. The group's sense of security was shattered on the fourth day when they realized their fortified position was becoming compromised. The infected had begun testing their defenses systematically, probing different entry points and working together to remove the barriers that had previously kept them safe. Marcus noticed that the creatures were bringing tools, rocks, broken glass, even pieces of metal, to aid in their assault on the building's defenses. The wooden boards covering the windows showed fresh damage each morning, and the sound of scratching and scraping continued throughout the night as the undead worked tirelessly to breach their sanctuary. During an emergency group meeting, Sarah presented her most disturbing discovery yet. Her analysis of the infection pattern suggested that the virus was not just transforming its hosts, it was networking them together, creating a distributed intelligence that grew stronger with each new addition to the horde. The infected were no longer just mindless predators, they were becoming something far more dangerous. As if summoned by her words, the sound of breaking glass echoed through the store, followed by the unmistakable moan of the undead. Their time in the grocery store fortress had come to an end, and the survivors faced their first major decision: fight for their current position or venture back into the dangerous world outside, where an evolving enemy was learning to hunt them with increasing efficiency. The shattering of glass marked the beginning of their desperate escape from the grocery store fortress. Marcus took charge immediately, his military training kicking in as he directed the group toward the back exit he had scouted days earlier. Sarah grabbed her research materials while Elena quickly gathered their medical supplies, and Tommy snatched his modified radio equipment that had been monitoring emergency frequencies. Mrs. Patterson, despite her age, moved with surprising agility as she collected the canned goods and water bottles that would sustain them during their flight. The infected poured through the broken windows with renewed vigor, their collective intelligence now focused on the humans who had eluded them for so long. The group's escape led them through a maze of abandoned buildings and debris-filled alleyways, with Marcus using his tactical knowledge to avoid the main streets where larger hordes of infected congregated. During their flight, Tommy's radio crackled to life with a weak signal broadcasting coordinates to what the mysterious voice claimed was a safe underground location. The transmission was brief and heavily distorted, but it provided their only hope of finding shelter before nightfall brought even greater dangers. Sarah noticed that the infected seemed less active during daylight hours, but their organized behavior suggested they were learning to overcome this limitation. Following the radio coordinates led them to what appeared to be an abandoned subway entrance, its metal gates long since rusted and partially collapsed. Marcus descended first, using a flashlight to illuminate the dark tunnel below while the others followed cautiously behind him. The underground passages were eerily quiet, with only the distant sound of dripping water echoing through the tunnels. Elena stayed close to Mrs. Patterson, helping the elderly woman navigate the uneven ground, while Tommy worked to establish communication with whoever had broadcast the coordinates. Their journey through the subway system revealed evidence of other survivors who had passed through before them. Makeshift camps with cold fire pits and scattered personal belongings told stories of desperate people seeking refuge in the underground darkness. Some areas showed signs of violent struggle, with dark stains on the walls and scattered clothing that suggested not all encounters between survivor groups had been peaceful. Sarah documented these observations in her notebook, recognizing that understanding human behavior during the crisis would be as important as studying the infected. The coordinates led them to a hidden entrance concealed behind a false wall in one of the older tunnel sections. Behind this barrier lay a Cold War-era bunker that had been forgotten by most government records but discovered by a group of urban explorers before the outbreak. The facility contained dormitory-style sleeping quarters, a functioning kitchen with canned food supplies, and most importantly, a sophisticated air filtration system that had protected the previous occupants from airborne contaminants. Tommy immediately began working to restore the bunker's communication systems, while Marcus secured the entrance and established watch schedules. Exploring deeper into the bunker revealed disturbing evidence of government experiments that may have contributed to the current crisis. File cabinets contained classified documents detailing viral research projects with names that matched some of the compounds Sarah had been studying at her own facility. The implications were staggering. The infection that had destroyed civilization might have been the result of military biological research gone wrong. Elena found medical records showing that test subjects had been exposed to experimental pathogens designed to enhance human performance, but the results had been catastrophic mutations that bore striking similarities to the current infected population. Their sense of security in the underground sanctuary began to deteriorate when Mrs. Patterson noticed strange sounds coming from the ventilation system. The facility's air circulation connected to multiple surface points throughout the city, creating a network of passages that the infected could potentially use to track their location. Sarah's analysis of the airflow patterns confirmed their worst fears. The enhanced senses of the infected were likely picking up their scent through the ventilation network, meaning their hidden refuge was slowly becoming a trap. The discovery of other survivor groups in the bunker's lower levels created new complications for their already precarious situation. Some of these groups had been hiding underground for weeks, slowly consuming the facility's resources and developing their own territorial claims. Tensions arose as different factions debated whether to share the limited supplies or establish dominance through force. Marcus found himself mediating between a group of hostile survivors who viewed newcomers as threats to their survival and a family with young children who desperately needed medical attention that only Elena and Sarah could provide. The bunker's security was ultimately compromised when Tommy's radio monitoring revealed that the infected above ground were systematically investigating every ventilation outlet connected to their underground network. The creatures had learned to follow scent trails through the complex tunnel system, and their organized search patterns suggested they were closing in on the bunker's location. As the sound of scratching and movement echoed through the air vents above their heads, the survivors faced a critical decision: remain in their compromised underground sanctuary and risk being trapped by an enemy that was learning to hunt them in 3 dimensions, or venture back to the surface where an evolving threat awaited them in the ruins of civilization. The decision to leave the compromised bunker came when the scratching sounds in the ventilation system grew so loud that sleep became impossible. Marcus made the call at dawn, gathering the group's essential supplies while the other survivor factions argued among themselves about the best course of action. Sarah noticed that the infected's behavioral patterns had shifted again. They were now active during daylight hours, suggesting their collective intelligence was adapting to overcome their initial limitations. The group emerged from the underground sanctuary into a world that had grown even more dangerous during their brief respite below ground. Their first destination was determined by a crackling emergency broadcast that Tommy had intercepted on his portable radio. The transmission came from St. Mary's Children's Hospital, where a group of medical staff claimed to be trapped on the upper floors with a dozen orphan children. The message was desperate and fading, suggesting their power source was failing and their situation was becoming critical. Elena immediately advocated for attempting a rescue mission, her nursing instincts overriding the obvious dangers of venturing into what was likely a heavily infected area of the city. The hospital stood like a monument to the world's collapse, its lower floors completely overrun with infected creatures that had been drawn by the sounds and scents of the trapped survivors above. Sarah observed that these weren't the same mindless predators they had encountered during the initial outbreak. These infected moved with purpose, some carrying makeshift tools and others working together to solve complex problems like opening doors and navigating obstacles. Most disturbing of all, she noticed that some of the creatures would pause mid-action, their vacant eyes flickering with what appeared to be fragments of human memory before returning to their predatory behavior. Marcus developed a plan that involved creating diversions on multiple floors while Sarah and Elena ascended through the hospital's emergency stairwell to reach the survivors. Tommy would coordinate their movements using walkie-talkies he had modified to work on secure frequencies, while Mrs. Patterson would remain with their supplies at a safe distance, ready to provide support or evacuation if the mission went wrong. The plan required perfect timing and relied on the infected's predictable response to noise and movement, but it was their only chance of saving the children without alerting the massive horde that had gathered in the hospital's main lobby. The rescue mission revealed the true horror of the infection's evolution. As they climbed through the hospital's darkened corridors, Sarah encountered infected individuals who retained enough of their human memories to recognize specific locations and objects. One creature, wearing a nurse's uniform, repeatedly tried to access a medication cabinet using muscle memory from her previous life. Another infected person sat in what had been his office, staring at family photos with an expression of confused recognition. These glimpses of retained humanity made the situation even more heartbreaking, as it suggested that somewhere within these monsters, fragments of the people they had been were still trapped. The children they rescued ranged in age from 4 to 14, all traumatized by days of hiding while listening to the infected trying to break through their barricaded door. The medical staff who had protected them were exhausted and dehydrated, but their determination to save the children had kept them alive when others had given up hope. Elena worked quickly to assess everyone's medical condition while Sarah helped Tommy establish communication with Marcus, who was coordinating the evacuation from the hospital's lower floors. The escape plan began to unravel when the infected demonstrated their most terrifying adaptation yet. They had learned to coordinate their attacks across multiple floors simultaneously. As Marcus set off his diversions on the second floor, infected creatures on the fourth and sixth floors began responding, suggesting they were somehow sharing information about the humans' location and movements. The hospital's stairwells became death traps as hundreds of infected converged on their position from above and below, forcing the group to improvise new escape routes through areas of the building they hadn't scouted. Marcus made his heroic sacrifice during the final moments of their escape, when it became clear that the infected had surrounded the hospital's main exits. Understanding that the children's survival was more important than his own, he created a massive distraction by detonating an improvised explosive device in the hospital's parking structure, drawing the infected away from the group's escape route. His final radio transmission to Sarah was brief but profound: "Keep them human. Don't let this world turn you into monsters." The explosion allowed the others to escape with the children, but the cost of their success left the surviving adults questioning whether their humanity was worth preserving in a world that seemed determined to destroy it. As they fled through the city streets with 12 traumatized children in tow, Sarah realized that their group had fundamentally changed. They were no longer just survivors fighting for their own lives. They had become guardians of the next generation, responsible for preserving not just human life but human values in a world where both were becoming increasingly rare. The weight of this responsibility would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The loss of Marcus weighed heavily on the group as they navigated through the city's abandoned suburbs with 12 frightened children in tow. Sarah had assumed leadership by necessity, though she felt inadequate compared to the sergeant's tactical expertise and natural authority. Elena worked tirelessly to keep the children calm and healthy, while Tommy monitored radio frequencies for any signs of organized rescue efforts. Mrs. Patterson surprised everyone by becoming a surrogate grandmother to the younger children, her gentle stories and songs providing comfort during their darkest moments as they searched for a new safe haven. For 3 days, they had been following a series of radio broadcasts that claimed to originate from a military safe zone established at the regional airport. The messages were professional and detailed, describing secure perimeters, medical facilities and regular supply drops from uncontaminated areas. The broadcasts included specific coordinates and authentication codes that suggested legitimate military operations, giving the desperate group hope that organized resistance to the outbreak still existed. Tommy's technical analysis of the radio signals indicated they were coming from the correct location, and the transmission quality suggested sophisticated equipment that only military forces would possess. The journey to the supposed safe zone took them through increasingly dangerous territory where the infected had established what Sarah could only describe as nesting areas. These locations showed evidence of primitive organization. Infected creatures had dragged furniture and debris to create crude shelters, and some areas contained stockpiles of items that the creatures seemed to collect without clear purpose. Most disturbing were the bone piles that suggested the infected were not just killing for immediate consumption but were storing remains for future use. These discoveries forced the group to travel primarily at night, when the infected seemed less active, making their progress slower and more exhausting. The airport appeared exactly as the radio broadcasts had described: high fences topped with razor wire, guard towers with searchlights, and military vehicles positioned at strategic points around the perimeter. The sight of uniformed figures moving within the compound brought tears of relief to Elena's eyes, and even Sarah felt a surge of hope that their nightmare might finally be ending. Tommy attempted to establish radio contact using the authentication codes they had been given, and received immediate responses that directed them to a specific gate where they would be processed for entry into the safe zone. The deception became apparent only when they had passed through the first checkpoint and were separated from their weapons for processing. The uniformed figures were not military personnel but desperate survivors who had discovered the abandoned airport and had been using its communication equipment to lure other survivor groups into their trap. Their leader, a man who called himself Colonel Martinez though his military knowledge was obviously fabricated, explained with disturbing casualness that they had been recruiting survivors for weeks, taking their supplies and forcing them to work in exchange for protection that was largely illusory. The confrontation erupted when Elena refused to allow the children to be separated from the adults for what Martinez claimed was medical evaluation. Sarah recognized the signs of a group that had abandoned their moral constraints in favor of survival at any cost. These people had become predators who viewed other survivors as resources to be exploited rather than fellow humans deserving of help. The airport group had created a hierarchy based on violence and intimidation, with the strongest members taking whatever they wanted from the weaker survivors who had been lured by the false promises of safety. The escape from the fake safe zone became a running battle through the airport's terminals and maintenance areas. Tommy proved invaluable by using his knowledge of the facility's layout, gained from studying airport schematics during their approach, to guide the group through service corridors that their captors didn't know existed. Mrs. Patterson kept the children calm and moving despite the chaos around them, while Sarah and Elena worked together to create diversions that confused their pursuers. The sound of gunfire echoed through the abandoned terminals as Martinez's group tried to prevent their valuable resources from escaping. Elena was struck by a ricocheting bullet during their desperate flight through the airport's parking structure, the wound in her shoulder bleeding heavily and limiting her mobility. The injury forced Sarah to make quick medical decisions using the limited supplies they had managed to recover during their escape, while Tommy established a secure perimeter and Mrs. Patterson comforted the terrified children. The irony was not lost on Sarah that they had been wounded not by the infected monsters that plagued the outside world, but by fellow humans who had chosen to abandon their humanity in favor of predatory survival. As they fled the airport under cover of darkness, the sound of infected creatures being drawn by the gunfire served as a grim reminder that the false safe zone would soon become a real death trap for Martinez and his followers. The group pressed on through the night, Elena's injury slowing their progress while Sarah wondered if they would ever find other survivors who still retained their moral compass in a world that seemed determined to strip away everything that made them human. Elena's shoulder wound had become infected despite Sarah's best efforts to treat it with their limited medical supplies, forcing the group to seek shelter in an abandoned pharmacy where they could search for antibiotics and proper wound care materials. The children had grown quieter over the past few days, the constant danger and loss of Marcus weighing heavily on their young minds. Mrs. Patterson worked tirelessly to maintain their spirits through storytelling and simple games, but Sarah could see the trauma etched in their faces. Tommy had been monitoring emergency frequencies when he intercepted a weak signal that changed everything. An automated distress beacon broadcasting from a research facility 30 miles north of their location. The signal contained technical specifications and research data that immediately caught Sarah's attention. The transmission included references to viral protein sequences and immunological responses that matched her own research from before the outbreak. More importantly, the automated message claimed that researchers at the facility had been working on a potential cure before their communication systems failed. The beacon was programmed to repeat every 6 hours, suggesting that whatever power source was maintaining it had been designed for long-term operation, possibly indicating that the facility's infrastructure was still intact. The journey to the research station took them through rural areas where the infected population was less dense but more unpredictable. Sarah observed that the creatures in these isolated areas had developed different behavioral patterns than their urban counterparts. They moved in smaller groups but seemed more aggressive and territorial. Some showed signs of advanced problem-solving abilities, using tools and coordinating hunting strategies that suggested the viral infection was continuing to evolve in different directions depending on environmental pressures. These discoveries reinforced her belief that finding a cure required understanding the infection's ongoing mutations. The research facility appeared intact from the outside, its solar panel arrays and backup generators still functional after weeks of abandonment. The building's automated security systems were operational, requiring Tommy's technical skills to override the electronic locks and gain entry. Inside, they discovered a treasure trove of scientific equipment and research data, including detailed studies of the viral outbreak's progression and several promising experimental treatments. The facility's isolation had protected it from the chaos that had destroyed most other research centers, preserving months of crucial work that could potentially save humanity. Dr. Amanda Foster's research logs, discovered in the facility's main laboratory, revealed the horrifying truth about the infection's origin and progression. The virus had been engineered as a biological weapon designed to enhance human performance, but its creators had underestimated its ability to self-modify and adapt. Foster's team had been close to developing a cure when the outbreak reached their facility, and her final entries described successful tests on infected laboratory animals that had been partially restored to normal behavior. The research data included detailed formulas for synthesizing the cure, but the process required specialized equipment and rare chemical compounds. Sarah's excitement about the cure was tempered by the discovery that they were not alone in the facility. The infected researchers who had remained trapped in the building when the outbreak reached them had not become typical zombies. Their scientific training and knowledge seemed to have been preserved in some twisted form. These creatures had been conducting their own experiments, creating hybrid organisms that combined viral samples with other biological specimens. The results were abominations that defied classification, creatures that possessed intelligence and purpose but served goals that no living human could comprehend. The hybrid creatures posed a threat unlike anything the group had encountered before. They retained enough human intelligence to understand complex concepts like strategy and deception, but their viral infection had given them physical capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations. Tommy discovered that these infected scientists had been using the facility's communication equipment to broadcast false signals, potentially luring other survivors to their location. The group realized they had walked into a trap that was far more sophisticated than anything they had faced previously. Elena's medical condition deteriorated rapidly as her infection spread, requiring immediate treatment with antibiotics they found in the facility's medical supplies. While Sarah worked to stabilize her condition, Mrs. Patterson kept the children safe in a secured laboratory while Tommy attempted to synthesize the cure using Foster's research notes. The process was complicated by the infected scientists' attempts to sabotage their work, forcing them to defend the laboratory while conducting delicate chemical procedures that could not be interrupted. The cure showed promise in preliminary tests, but Sarah realized that mass production would require resources and facilities that no longer existed in their collapsed world. Even if they could create enough doses to treat their own group, the question remained whether other survivors would trust them enough to accept the treatment. The infected scientists' continued presence in the facility meant that their time was limited. They would need to complete their work and escape before the hybrid creatures found a way to breach the laboratory's defenses and transform them into something far worse than ordinary zombies. The breakthrough came during Elena's darkest hour, when her fever spiked to dangerous levels and Sarah feared they would lose her before the cure could be completed. Using Dr. Foster's research notes and the facility's remaining chemical supplies, Sarah successfully synthesized the first viable doses of the treatment. The cure worked differently than traditional medicine. Instead of killing the virus, it reprogrammed the infected cells to restore normal human cognitive function while leaving enhanced physical capabilities intact. Elena's recovery was rapid and remarkable, her shoulder wound healing at an accelerated rate while her mental clarity returned completely within hours of receiving the treatment. The success of Elena's treatment provided proof that the cure could work, but Sarah realized that their small victory was meaningless unless they could share the formula with other surviving research facilities around the world. Tommy had discovered that the research station's communication array was powerful enough to broadcast globally, but activating the system would require them to reach the facility's radio tower, which was located in the most dangerous part of the complex where the infected scientists had established their primary laboratory. The tower's activation would also send a beacon signal that would attract every infected creature within a 50-mile radius. Their escape plan required splitting the group to maximize their chances of success while protecting the children who had become their most precious responsibility. Mrs. Patterson volunteered to lead the children to a secure bunker beneath the facility, where they could wait safely while the adults completed their mission. Elena, despite her recent recovery, insisted on accompanying Sarah to the radio tower, arguing that her medical expertise might be crucial if anything went wrong during the broadcast. Tommy would coordinate their movements while simultaneously working to upload the cure formula to every accessible scientific database on the planet. The journey through the research facility revealed the full extent of the infected scientists' twisted experiments. Laboratories that had once been dedicated to saving lives now contained horrors that defied scientific explanation. Hybrid creatures that combined human DNA with viral mutations, creating organisms that served purposes no living person could understand. These abominations possessed intelligence and malevolent intent, but their goals seemed focused on spreading the infection in new and more efficient ways. Sarah documented everything she observed, knowing that understanding these mutations would be crucial for developing future treatments. The radio tower stood like a beacon of hope above the facility's main laboratory, but reaching it meant traversing areas where the infected scientists had concentrated their most dangerous experiments. Tommy discovered that these creatures had been monitoring communication frequencies, learning about human rescue operations and survival strategies by intercepting radio transmissions. They had evolved beyond simple predators. They were becoming strategic opponents who understood their enemies and adapted their tactics accordingly. The group's approach to the tower would need to account for intelligent resistance rather than mindless aggression. Elena's enhanced abilities, a side effect of the cure treatment, proved invaluable during their ascent to the radio tower. Her improved strength and reflexes allowed her to navigate obstacles that would have been impossible for a normal human, while her retained medical knowledge helped her understand the infected scientists' behavioral patterns. Sarah realized that the cure didn't simply restore humanity, it created something new, a hybrid between human intelligence and viral enhancement that might represent the next stage of human evolution. The broadcasting process required precise timing and technical expertise that pushed Tommy's abilities to their limits. As he worked to establish connections with research facilities on 6 continents, Sarah and Elena defended the tower from increasingly sophisticated attacks by the infected scientists. These creatures had learned to coordinate their assaults, using complex strategies that suggested they possessed not just individual intelligence but collective planning abilities. The battle for the radio tower became a contest between human ingenuity and viral evolution, with the fate of the remaining human population hanging in the balance. The successful transmission of the cure formula was accomplished at tremendous cost. The tower's activation created a massive electromagnetic pulse that attracted infected creatures from across the region, turning the research facility into the center of a converging zombie apocalypse. Tommy's final transmission confirmed that the formula had been received by research stations in 12 countries, but the tower's location was now compromised beyond any hope of defense. The group had succeeded in their mission to share the cure with the world, but their success had also created the largest gathering of infected creatures since the initial outbreak. As hundreds of zombies surrounded the research facility, Sarah understood that their victory was simultaneously their greatest triumph and their most desperate hour. They had given humanity the tools needed to survive and rebuild, but they had also placed themselves at the center of a convergence that might represent the final battle between human civilization and viral extinction. The cure was spreading across the globe, but whether the original discoverers would survive to see its implementation remained an open question as the infected masses began their assault on the tower. 6 months had passed since the desperate transmission from the research facility's radio tower, and the world that emerged from the ashes of civilization bore little resemblance to the one that had existed before the outbreak. Sarah stood on the observation deck of their newly constructed settlement, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of hope that had seemed impossible during those dark early days. The community they had built in the ruins of a small college town represented something unprecedented in human history, a society where the cured and the partially infected lived and worked together, creating a new definition of what it meant to be human. The rescue from the research facility had come at the last possible moment, when a coalition of international military forces finally responded to Tommy's global broadcast. The cure formula had spread faster than anyone had anticipated, reaching research facilities that had been working independently on similar treatments. Within weeks, mass production of the cure began in protected facilities around the world, though the treatment's effects varied significantly depending on how long individuals had been infected. Elena's case had become the template for understanding the cure's transformative properties. Those treated early retained full human consciousness while gaining enhanced physical capabilities. Their settlement had become a model for post-apocalyptic recovery, attracting survivors from hundreds of miles away who sought to join a community that offered both safety and purpose. Mrs. Patterson had established the settlement school, where the children they had rescued now learned alongside other young survivors, their education including both traditional subjects and the new realities of living in a world forever changed by the viral outbreak. Tommy had evolved into the community's technology coordinator, using salvaged equipment to maintain communication networks that connected their settlement with other recovery zones across the continent. The partially cured infected who lived among them presented ongoing challenges that required constant adaptation and understanding. These individuals retained fragments of their viral enhancements while recovering most of their human cognitive abilities, creating a new class of people who possessed capabilities beyond normal human limitations but struggled with memory gaps and altered perceptual experiences. Sarah had become their primary advocate and researcher, working to understand how the cure continued to evolve within their systems and developing treatments for the psychological trauma associated with remembering their time as infected creatures. Elena's transformation had been the most dramatic of all the survivors, her enhanced healing abilities and increased strength making her an invaluable asset to the community's defense and medical care. However, her psychological journey had been the most difficult, as she retained vivid memories of her time as a partially infected individual and the moral weight of actions she had taken while not fully in control of her faculties. Her work with other recovering individuals had become a cornerstone of the community's mental health programs, providing hope and guidance for those struggling to reconcile their pre-infection identities with their current enhanced capabilities. The infected creatures that remained uncured posed an ongoing but manageable threat to the settlement. Sarah's research had revealed that the virus continued to evolve in the wild, but without access to human hosts for extended periods, its development had slowed significantly. The creatures that approached their settlement were often in the early stages of neural degradation, suggesting that the viral infection was ultimately unsustainable without regular genetic material from healthy humans. The community's defense protocols focused on containment and cure attempts rather than elimination, reflecting their commitment to preserving life whenever possible. Trade relationships with other settlements had created a network of mutual support that spanned the continent, with each community contributing specialized knowledge and resources to the collective recovery effort. Their settlement had become known for its medical expertise and rehabilitation programs, attracting researchers and healers who were working to understand the long-term implications of the cure. Sarah's research notes had become foundational documents for post-apocalyptic medicine, providing insights that helped communities around the world develop their own treatment protocols. The sunrise that morning brought news from Tommy's radio communications that the last major infected population center had been successfully treated, marking the end of the acute phase of the apocalypse. However, Sarah understood that their work was far from finished. The cure had created as many questions as it had answered, and the task of rebuilding civilization would require generations of careful planning and adaptation. The children playing in the settlement's courtyard represented hope for a future where the lessons learned from humanity's darkest hour would prevent such catastrophes from recurring. As she watched Elena teaching a group of partially cured individuals how to control their enhanced abilities, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them from the silent dawn of the outbreak to this moment of cautious optimism. They had discovered that survival wasn't just about fighting monsters. It was about preserving the values and compassion that made them human, even when the definition of humanity itself was evolving. The world had ended, but from its ashes, something new and potentially better was beginning to grow.